Chapter 54. Monte Cristo had come back to town with Emmanuel and Maximilian. Their return was gay. Emmanuel did not conceal his joy at having seen war give way to peace. Maximilian, sitting in a corner of the carriage, let his brother-in-law's gaiety evaporate in words and kept to himself a joy that was equally sincere but which shone only in his eyes. At the Barriere du Trône they met Bertuccio, who was waiting for them like a sentry at his post. Monte Cristo put his head out the window of the carriage, exchanged a few words with him in an undertone, and the steward disappeared. "Please take me home now, Count," said Emmanuel when they were near the Place Royale, "so that my wife won't have to worry any longer about either of us." "I would ask you to come with us," said Maximilian, "but I'm sure there's someone you want to reassure also. Here we are, Emmanuel. Let's say goodbye to our friend and let him go on his way." "Wait a moment," said Monte Cristo. "Don't deprive me of both my companions at once. Go into your charming wife, Emmanuel, and give her my compliments, and you, Maximilian, come with me to the Champs-Élysées." "I'll be glad to," said Maximilian, "especially since I have a personal matter to attend to in your neighborhood." "Shall I expect you for dinner?" asked Emmanuel. "No," replied Maximilian. The carriage continued on its way. "You see how I bring you good luck," said Maximilian when he was alone with the Count. "You didn't expect it, did you?" "Of course, that's why I wanted you with me." "What happened this morning was miraculous. Albert is brave. There is no question of that." "Very brave," said Monte Cristo. "I once saw him sleep with a sword almost literally hanging over his head. And I know he's fought tool duels and fought them very well. Reconcile that with his conduct this morning." "It was your influence," said the Count, smiling. "It's lucky for Albert that he's not a soldier." "Why?" "An apology on the field of honor," said the young captain, shaking his head. "Come now," said the Count gently. "You're not going to fall into the prejudices of ordinary men, are you, Maximilian? Won't you agree that since Albert is brave, he can't be cowardly, he must have a good reason for acting as he did this morning, and that his conduct was therefore rather heroic than base?" No doubt," replied Maximilian. "You'll have lunch with me, won't you?" asked the Count, cutting short the conversation. "No, I'll leave you at 10 o'clock. Your personal matter is an appointment then for lunch?" Maximilian shook his head. "But you'll have lunch somewhere, won't you?" "Suppose I'm not hungry?" "Ah!" exclaimed the Count. "I know of only two emotions that can take away a man's appetite: grief, and since fortunately I see that you're gay, I know it's not that, and love. Now, after what you told me this morning, I can only suppose—" "Oh, I won't deny it," said Maximilian gaily. "And you haven't told me about it," said the Count in a tone which showed how deeply concerned he was to know the secret. "I showed you this morning that I had a heart, didn't I, Count?" Monte Cristo's only reply was to hold out his hand to the young man. "Well," continued Maximilian, "since my heart is no longer with you in the Bois de Vincennes, it's somewhere else, and I'm going there to find it again." "Go then, my friend," said the Count slowly, "but promise me that if you should ever encounter any obstacles, you'll remember that I have a certain amount of power in this world, that I'm glad to use it to help people I'm fond of, and that I'm very fond of you, Maximilian." "Very well," replied the young man. "I'll remember that in the way selfish children remember their parents when they need them. If I ever need you, Count, and it's quite possible that I will, I'll come to you. I consider that a promise. And now goodbye." They had arrived in front of the Count's house on the Champs-Élysées. Monte Cristo opened the door of the carriage, and Maximilian alighted. Bertuccio was waiting on the front steps. Maximilian walked off down the Avenue de Marigny as Monte Cristo hurried up to Bertuccio. "Well," he asked. "She's going to leave his house," replied Bertuccio. "And what about her son? Florentine, his valet, thinks he's going to do the same thing." "Come with me." Monte Cristo led Bertuccio into his study, wrote the letter we have already seen, handed it to him, and said, "Deliver this immediately. Before you go, notify Haydée that I've come back." "Here I am," said Haydée, who, hearing the sound of the Count's carriage, had already come downstairs, her face radiant with joy at seeing him safe and sound. Bertuccio left. Monte Cristo's joy, while less apparent, was no less intense than Haydée's. He had recently begun to realize something which he had not dared to believe before, that there was another Mercedes in this world, that he might once again be happy. He was gazing ardently into Haydée's moist eyes when suddenly the door opened. He frowned. "The Count of Morcerf," announced Baptistin. "Oh," cried Haydée, "isn't it finished yet?" "I don't know if it's finished yet," said Monte Cristo, taking both her hands in his, "but I do know that there's nothing to fear. That man can do me no harm. It was when I was dealing with his son that there was reason to fear." "You'll never know how I suffered," said Haydée. Monte Cristo smiled and said, "I swear to you that if there is any misfortune, it will not happen to me." "I believe it as if God himself had told me," said Haydée. Monte Cristo placed a kiss on her forehead, which made two hearts beat more rapidly. "Oh God," he thought, "could it be that you will allow me to love a second time?" Then he turned to Baptistin and said, Show the Count de Morcerf into the salon. The general was pacing the length of the floor for the third time when Monte Cristo joined him in the salon. "Ah, it's really you, Monsieur de Morcerf," said the Count calmly. "I thought perhaps I had heard wrong." "Yes, it is I," said the general, with a frightful contraction of his lips which prevented him from articulating clearly. "And to what do I owe the pleasure of seeing the Count de Morcerf at such an early hour?" "You had a meeting with my son this morning." "Did you know about that?" "Yes, and I also know that my son had a good reason to fight you and do his best to kill you." "That's true. But as you can see, in spite of his reasons, he didn't kill me. In fact, he didn't even fight me. Yet he considered you the cause of his father's dishonor and of the horrible disaster which has fallen on my house." "That's also true," said Monte Cristo with his terrible calm. "I was the secondary cause, although not the primary one." "Then no doubt you apologized to him or gave him some explanation." "I gave him no explanation, and it was he who apologized to me." "And to what do you attribute his conduct?" "To his conviction, probably. But there was another man guiltier than I." "Who was that man?" "His father." "Perhaps," said Morcerf, turning pale, "but you know a guilty man doesn't like to have his guilt thrown in his face." "Yes, I know, and I expected this." "You expected my son to be a coward?" cried the general. "Monsieur Albert de Morcerf is not a coward," said Monte Cristo. "A man who stands before a mortal enemy with a sword in his hand and does not fight is a coward. I wish he were here so I could tell him so." "I don't suppose you've come here to tell me about your family affairs," said Monte Cristo coldly. "Go tell that to your son. Perhaps he'll be able to answer you." "No, that's not why I came," said Morcerf, with a smile which vanished almost as soon as it appeared. "I came to tell you that I, too, consider you an enemy. I came to tell you that I hate you instinctively, that it seems to me I've always known you and always hated you, and that finally, since the young men of this generation apparently no longer fight duels, we must do so ourselves. Do you agree?" "Certainly. When I told you I expected this, I was referring to the honor of your visit." "Very well. Are you ready?" "I'm always ready." "You understand that we will fight until one of us is dead," said the general, clenching his teeth in rage. "Till one of us is dead," repeated Monte Cristo, slowly nodding his head. "Let's go, then. We have no need of seconds." "Yes, that would be useless. We know each other so well." "On the contrary, it's because we don't know each other." "Are you sure?" asked Monte Cristo with the same exasperating coolness. "Aren't you the soldier Fernand who deserted on the eve of battle of Waterloo? Aren't you the Lieutenant Fernand who served the French army as a guide and spy in Spain? Aren't you the Colonel Fernand who betrayed, sold out, and assassinated his benefactor Ali Pasha? And haven't all those Fernands put together made Lieutenant General Fernand Count of Morcerf and peer of France?" "Scoundrel!" cried the general, as though struck by a red-hot iron. "You confront me with my shame just as you're perhaps about to kill me. I didn't say I was a stranger to you. I know, you demon, that you've penetrated into the darkness of my past and read every page of my life by the light of some torch unknown to me. But maybe there's still more honor in me, even in my disgrace, than there is in you beneath all your outward pomp. No, I'm not a stranger to you. I know that. But I know nothing about you. You adventurer made up of gold and jewels. In Paris, you call yourself the Count of Monte Cristo. In Italy, Sinbad the Sailor. In Malta, God knows what. But I want to know your real name, so that I can pronounce it on the field of honor as I plunge my sword into your heart." Monte Cristo's eyes glowed fiercely. He rushed into an adjoining room and threw off his coat and vest. A moment later, he returned wearing a sailor's blouse and a sailor's hat, and stood before Morcerf with his arms crossed and an expression of implacable hatred on his face. Morcerf's teeth chattered, and he felt his legs giving way beneath him, and he stepped back until he found him a table on which to support himself. "Fernand," roared Monte Cristo, "one of my names is enough to strike terror into your heart. But I don't have to tell you what it is, do I? You've already guessed it, haven't you? Or rather, you remember it, for in spite of all my years of sorrow and torment, the joy of vengeance has made my face young again, and it's a face you must have seen often in your dreams ever since your marriage to Mercedes, my fiancée." The general stared at this terrible apparition in silence. Then, leaning against the wall, he slowly slid along to the door and backed out of the room, uttering only this piercing, terror-stricken cry, "Edmond Dantes!" Gasping in an inhuman way, he dragged himself to the front of the house, staggered across the courtyard as if he were drunk, and fell into the arms of his valet. "Home, home!" he muttered, almost unintelligibly. The fresh air and the shame he felt at having made a spectacle of himself in front of his servants helped him to regain some measure of composure. But it was a short trip, and the nearer he came to his home, the more anguish came rushing back to him. He stopped the carriage in front of the house and got out. The door of the house was wide open, and a hired carriage whose driver seemed surprised at having been called to such a magnificent residence was standing in the middle of the courtyard. The general looked at it in terror, then went inside and ran toward his room, not daring to question anyone. 2 people were coming down the stairs. Quickly hiding himself behind a curtain in order to avoid them, he saw Mercedes leaning on Albert's arm. They were leaving the house. "Courage, mother," he heard his son say. "This is no longer our home." The words and the footsteps died away in the distance. The general clung to the curtain, struggling to hold back the most terrible sob that ever burst from the bosom of a man abandoned by his wife and his son at the same time. Soon he heard the door of the carriage being closed and its driver calling out to the horses. The rumbling of the heavy vehicle shook the window panes. He rushed into his bedroom to catch one last glimpse of all that he had loved on earth. But the carriage went past without either of their heads appearing at the window to take a farewell glance at the lonely house or their forsaken husband and father. Just as the carriage was passing beneath the arch of the gate, a shot rang out, and dark smoke floated out through one of the bedroom windows, which had been shattered by the force of the explosion.